You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Peter Hurley is one of the premier headshot and portrait photographers in New York City, some might say on the planet. He's best known for the genuine expressions he captures in his executive portraits and actor headshots. His work is very good and consistently so. After some interesting twists and turns early in life, as a member of the U.S. Olympic sailing team and as a model and later friend of photographer Bruce Weber, he began his photo career shooting the art commercial and portrait jobs. He honed his craft, and before long, he's being profiled on a camera blog. He's invited to make a television appearance and a few viral YouTube videos. And next thing you know, boom, he's the headshot king. In addition to creating a catalog of incredible photos, he's become an author, a TED Talker, and a successful businessman in his own right. Peter is the founder of the Headshot Crew, which is now the world's largest network of headshot specialists with over 15,000 members worldwide. And all that from a kid from Mantoloking, New Jersey. Not bad. Welcome to the show, Peter.
I love that, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great here. We're going to be talking with Peter about the Headshot Crew, but we also want to talk about his sailing years and about a wonderful endeavor he's been part of, and that is to photograph 10,000 headshots free of charge for folks unemployed during the COVID quarantine. Thank you for joining us. Tell us about this 2000 Olympic trials. This is something that a lot of people probably do not know about. You were neck and neck with a friend, and you finished fourth, good enough to make the team, but you didn't go.
I had, what happened was I had trained for the 96 Olympics and failed. So I came to New York and I became this model actor bartender dude, and I kind of got sick of that. And in 1999, another mentor of mine said, "What are you doing? Why aren't you going for the Olympics?" And I was like, I just looked at it, I was like, I don't know. And
How long had you been into sailing? Because you don't just wake up one day and go, "I'm going to be an Olympic sailor." I mean, this is something you had to be doing for a while, I would imagine.
Yeah, I grew up in Mantoloking in the summers, and my dad had trained for the Olympics and was a North American champion, and he
okay, it's in your blood. Okay.
Threw me in the boat real early, like, I don't know, I must have been 6 or 7 or something like that.
Great.
So what happened in 2000 then? I remember hearing something that you decided after that input from your friend and colleague to go for it, right? I mean,
yeah, I just shifted my entire life on one decision. I threw my boat in a truck and shipped it across the country to San Francisco, and I started training, and I had a year till the Olympic trials. And, obviously the goal was to get to the Olympics and represent the U.S. and really try and win a gold medal. And everybody said, "You're crazy. In a year, you can't do that." And I think I was peaking. I hadn't peaked at the Olympic trials. I was beginning to peak. I did really well at the World Championships in Cancun right before the Olympic trials. And then I was winning the Olympic trials after the first day. And I thought, oh my gosh, this could become a reality. And then I freaked out and had a couple bad days. And then I came back strong in the end. But 5 guys make the U.S. team. At least back then, that's the way they did it. And I missed it in the last race of the Olympic trials in 96. So one of my goals in life was to be a member of the United States sailing team. And it came down to the last race in the Olympic trials in 2000. And I ended up just missing third, and only the first guy goes. So I went to Sydney and trained for a month, which was an amazing experience. I love the travel that I did with the sailing and everything. But, I kind of call it, now I've been reflecting on it, and I'm calling myself a 180-degree loser because I lost the Olympic trials and I got booted, and my girlfriend at the time was going to Europe to model, and I was like, "I'll go with you." And I just went with her, and then I ended up in Madrid, and I had modeled there previously, and this guy's like, "Why don't you buy a camera while you're here?" So I was like, okay. And I got my first professional camera in Madrid, and that's how it all started. I came back to the United States. He taught me how to use a darkroom, and I came back to the United States, walked right into B&H and bought my first darkroom and set it up in my mom's basement, and I was ready to roll.
Wow. So can I jump back a little bit to the Olympic trials? When you say, you failed or you didn't do quite so well, is it all time? Is that the determinant of who wins and who, in sailing? I don't know much about it, but is it straight up
Well,
on the speed?
the way that it works in the ice sail dinghy sailor, like the sailing in the Olympics is all small boats. So we go out for the day, sail a couple races and come in. So it's usually two races, I think, at the Olympic level. And I remember going out doing two races and coming back in. So the first day I think I got a first and a fourth. So I was winning the regatta, and then after, and you had to qualify just to get into that regatta. So it wasn't easy as well. But yeah, you do a series of races between buoys. You start everybody starts on the same starting line, and you just try and, beat your competitors, and you go around a trapezoid course, actually is what they're doing now. And the races last they're trying to shoot for around 45 minutes, something like that is usually about the time frame. And the boat that I sailed was called a laser. It's a single-handed boat, so it's just me on it. And a lot of it was technique, and I feel badly for the athletes that missed the Olympics this summer, because now it's a year later, and the way I was trying to peak for my Olympic trials and the Olympic Games in 2000, I know what they go through, and it's like, I'm a big procrastinator, to tell you the truth, but on the Olympics, you just don't procrastinate. Like, it's a deadline that just does not get skipped, and to get it skipped this year was huge. But for me back then, it was like that was the one thing that kept my life in order. It's like that date is not moving, and I have to be ready. And I think in life, a lot of I think back to that, of the things I'm procrastinating on. I'm like, oh my gosh, with the Olympics, there was none of that. So I took a lot of the stuff that I did while training with me into starting my career, I guess. And one of the most interesting things I think about the Olympic trials that second time for me was that I was in a seminar. When I made this decision, my mentor his name's Bob Proctor, and he was doing a seminar, and he said, "Are you going for the Olympics?" And it was a 2-day seminar, and I was like, I didn't even thought about it. I went back home that night, and I couldn't sleep, and then I went back in the next day, and I said, I'm going to go for it. And he had Milt Campbell on stage with him, and Milt won the decathlon in 1956, and he said, I'm going to coach you. So I was immediately getting coached by the guy who won the gold medal in the decathlon in 1956. And it was a really interesting experience. And I wish I had, Milt's gone now. And my experience with him was just phenomenal, to be able to hang out with him and pick his brain and have him coach me.
Right.
He had me doing some really interesting stuff mentally. It was incredible.
And what do you attribute, it might just be luck, but these kind of moments that seem to have happened to you a few times anywhere, where your life stumbled into the right person who gave you direction. Is that, do you consider yourself open for these kind of things? Because a lot of people will shut that down, fears get in the way or other things, or is it just luck?
That's very interesting. I found that, there's this saying that luck is what opportunity, preparedness meets opportunity, or something like that.
Right.
I feel like I'm one of these guys that just doesn't have a plan. I never had a plan. I never knew what I wanted to do in life. And I just kind of roll with it. And then something happens in front of me, and I'm like, oh, go that way. It's like I'm getting thrown these bones, and I'm like, I'll pick that one up. And these things happen. And I like to say that I think, and everybody can probably think this in life, like the big moves in life and the big decisions and the big things that happen all revolve around a human being interaction. And these people that changed my life over the course of the years, it creates this like left-hand turn. You're like going straight, and then all of a sudden you bump into a human being, and that person, for some reason, changes your life completely. And that, I think, that was the biggest decision that I made in my life up to that point, and actually in my entire life up till now, was making the decision to jump ship on what I was doing and go train for the Olympics again. I'm really proud of being a member of the U.S. sailing team. That would have never happened, and I don't believe if I hadn't done that, I might not have even picked up a camera.
Right. Well, also, those kind of decisions breed a kind of confidence, or at least a kind of, I don't know how to say it, but maybe confidence is the word, but you go, okay, well, this one worked out, even if I wasn't planning it. And then the next time it comes around, you have that little in your backpack. You say, all right, well, I did it that time. Maybe I can do it again, or you give yourself the little push that you need.
Yeah, I kind of always dive in. I'm not a skeptical person. I just go, and I've always been that way. And I think that I don't know how much fear I felt then. I certainly wasn't confident, going back to train for the Olympics after not doing it for 4 years. But I had a sense. I love sailing, and I knew I had a gift, and it came together. It was an experience that was like unbelievable. I mean, who gets to go around the world, sailing against the best guys in the world? I still do it. I do it now. It keeps me in shape, and it gives me goals. And I'm attempting to be a world champion now. I've been second now I do it in my age class. I'm second. I've been second in the world twice since I turned 40. So I'm in this group 45 to 55 year olds. Mm-hmm. And the first year I got in after taking a big hiatus, I got second in the world. And I was like, okay, I'm going to win this thing. And then a couple years later, it was like a downhill slide. And then I got second again. I almost won. And then then this year it was in Australia. And I was down there when the whole COVID thing hit. And I was like, oh my gosh. And they canceled it like the day after I got there. So it was a big mess. And I had workshops down there and everything set up. And then my wife's like, why are you even going? So anyway, I love it. It keeps me in shape. And it's just, the boat is it's just an amazing sport because I can compete at a very high level. And I still do sail against the Olympians. I get my butt kicked, but I was in Japan last year. I qualified for the World Championships against all the guys that are training for the Olympics, and I went. And I took it as a family trip from to go to Japan. My kids loved it, and I competed against the best in the world at the age 50. So it's pretty cool.
Now, growing up in Mantoloking, do you remember when that Barnegat Bay would actually freeze back in the day? Do you remember that?
I was not down there in the winters very often. I don't think I winter very often. So my friend's ice boat on Tom's River and stuff when it does freeze, but I don't think I ever walked on it frozen.
Okay, because they have the ice boats, but even better than that, and they haven't done this for a while because it hasn't. The bay doesn't freeze as much. This is a little bit of a sidestep. It's kind of an interesting story. Is that during the winter they have competitions out there between Cadillacs and Lincoln Continentals. They have races out there, and they used to do this. And
which one did you have, Alex?
They would call the police, and the police would say there's no law against driving cars on Barnegat Bay, and they'd call the Coast Guard, and they would say there's no laws about driving a car on Barnegat, so nobody would bother them. And at the bottom of Barnegat Bay, there are about a half a dozen Lincolns and caddies sitting down there that every once in a while just went through.
No way.
You could check that out. Yeah, it hasn't frozen for the longest time, but if you go back about 20, 30 years ago, this is what they were doing out there, and nobody bothered them.
Well, the current changed completely, so the current's a lot stronger than it was 30 years ago. That's the one thing I noticed. And then we used to have a lot of seaweed patches that we'd have to sail around. There's a lot less now because of the current is running really swiftly. So for it to freeze would be a little bit more difficult. I guess that might be part of it. I really don't know, but that's really interesting.
Now I'm going to ask a question that just got to me. And again, you're a driven person. And it's pretty obvious, and you have a lot of enthusiasm behind whatever you're doing. Do you see any kind of connections between sailing and photography? I mean, I always say, I know that, writing and photography, I could put together all kinds, and music and photography, I could pick up things. What about sailing? Is there any connection between the two?
I would have to, I've never thought about it till you just hit me with that, but I
only thought about 30 seconds before I asked you, so we're all winging it now. This is great.
Here we go. I would visually, obviously, like when I get on the race course, I've got a buoy. Usually the first one is about a mile away. So you're like, you've got to be really visual on your awareness around the course. So I'm looking all over the place. You're also positioning between boats. And when you start, you're kind of blinded by these sails and trying to get the nose of your boat as close to the starting line as possible. If you go over it, then you get disqualified and you have to go back and restart. So nobody wants to do that. So
you're reading the wind while all this is going on at the same time.
Yeah, it's like, I say it's like playing chess while the board's moving around.
Yes.
It's crazy.
Great.
It's very
Yes.
strategic. It's very, there's a lot of mental activity. The cognitive load while you're sailing is huge. And I found that the only thing that I've discovered about myself, I don't know if I had this when I was younger because I never really was that focused on anything when I was younger. But when I picked up a camera and then when I started speaking, I started teaching and I started working, I was working with this psychologist and she goes, we did our TEDx talk together and stuff. So we were working on it and she's like, you're like a lighthouse. When the beam's on me, I'm good. But then your brain just goes somewhere and I got to wait until it comes back around for you to be back on this topic again. So I'm very like, so she's like, you're like ADHD, you're all over the place. And I never had that or knew about that when I was younger or anything. And what I found was there's only two things that really change it for me. And it's when I look through the viewfinder of a camera. I'm like hyper focused. Like I see everything, like everything's there. Everything like is just, when you put a human in there, I'm seeing the clothes, I'm seeing the expression, I'm seeing the face, I'm seeing the posture, I'm seeing the composition. Everything's like boom, right in my brain. And I see a lot of things that I know other people aren't even catching. It's
so therefore you just answered my question. You just answered my question. The answer is yes, there is a connection between the two because again, when you're starting a race, you're watching that buoy that's in the distance. You're watching everyone going around you. You're measuring the wind and feeling the current of the tides, okay? And you just told me the same thing. When you're looking through that camera, you're zeroing in on your subject and you're aware of everything else going on around you. So, yeah, there is a connection, I guess.
That's it. I think you just have to love something and then it just changes everything. I have like this totem pole of things that matter to me in my brain and whatever's on top is the most important. So the minute that eye goes through that viewfinder, it's that. And when I'm on a starting line, there's nothing that's going to enter my brain, that's not focused on that race.
And by the way, I think this is true of a lot of different things, no matter what you're into. This is anything that you have a passion for. And this could go for birding. This can go for painting. This can go for any number of things, roller skating, if that's what you're into. But if you have a passion for something and when you're doing it, you just go away, you zone out, you go into another place and it becomes everything at the center of your universe. And I guess that's what it's about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And have you ever combined the two? I mean, do you bring a camera on the boat? Do you take any sailing photos when you're out there, or too focused?
Oh my gosh! So when I got my camera, I was like, I'm gonna start. I mean, it was all film. I guess the first pictures of sailboats that I remember, I shot with a Hurley that I have, an old Hurley, and I think I was on a motorboat watching. But then when people would ask me to sail, it would be like, okay, I'll go out with you on a boat, but I've got to bring my camera with me. So I remember we were doing Block Island Race Week. I got invited to be the tactician. I had just come off the Olympic trials. And I was the tactician on this boat. And I had never done a big boat race really. And I'd never been a tactician, but I was like, I'll do it if I can bring my camera. And then during the start, I was like running around taking pictures. I don't even know. I don't think I got anything good or anything, but we ended up winning the regatta too. So, and my friend who was the skipper who invited me on the boat, the winning boat won a Rolex. So every time I see him, like he's a coach now. So anytime he's out, and I'm out at a regatta, he's got to tow me out. He's got to take my lunch. He's got to take my water bottles. He's like, I was like, otherwise you wouldn't have that thing on your wrist.
That's great. Yeah. And do you enjoy sailing? I mean, photography and sailing. I mean, do you get the same thrill that you might when you're working, portraiture? Do you getting that great shot?
Yeah. It's, it's funny because I have a couple friends that are sailing photographer and they shoot sailing all the time. And one of them's Anna Vanderwall. He's another explorer of light for Canon. And Anna and I, it's the funniest. This story is just crazy to me. So I'm minding my own business, training for the Olympics in 1995 and just started a little bit of modeling, but I'm at the Miami Sailing Center in Coconut Grove where we trained out of. It's the U.S. Sailing Center there. And I don't know where I met. I think I met Anna I think I met him there. I might have met him. We did a job for Sunfish Laser. We did the advertising. So I got hired as a model to do the ads for the new boats coming out. This boat called an Escape, and we went to Captive Island, I think it was, and Anna was the photographer. So I spent like 3 days working with him, which was just amazing. So then I went back to Miami, and I'm in the parking lot, and he comes up to me and he goes, look, I've got this boat that I got to take some pictures of. Do you mind going out and driving it? And I was like, sure, let's go. So I get in this thing. It was a Viper. And it had just been a new boat. Now it's been a successful class, and there's some classes all over the world with it. And I'm driving it, and he's taking pictures, and it ends up on the cover of Sailing World magazine. I flip it over, like it was a mess, but it was fun. So I pick up years later. This is years later. This was in like 1995. In 2000, I pick up a camera, and in 2001, I moved to the West Side Highway, and I get an apartment in a high rise out there with a southern facing window, because that's what I wanted to shoot. I wanted to shoot natural light. I didn't really know lighting at all. I was like, I just want to use a window. I'll just do that. And that's how I started my career. But I'm overlooking the Javits Center. So every year Photo Plus Expo is going on. I go down there, and Anna's a speaker. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is cool. Anna's speaking. I'm going to go see him speak. So I go see him speak. And, he's got all these accolades and stuff. And then I don't know how it happened, but I ended up, like, I never thought in 2000 that I would ever speak at that thing, or my career would ever go the direction it went. But I ended up, every time I get on stage there, it's like, wow, I remember coming here and sitting in the audience and doing that. And then I became an explorer of light, and Anna's like, this is crazy. You used to be a model for me. Now you're an explorer of light too. So we are talking about meshing the sailing. Like, we're trying to figure out how to do something with Canon where Anna and I are going to, revisit our roots of our relationship together and figure something out. Cause he's just a great guy, and he's so talented. So I never, I only let the worlds collide, like what we said earlier, when like a bone's thrown my way. I got lucky. I was doing this thing called the Headshot Cruise. So I have the Headshot Crew. It's my coaching platform, and it's a referral engine for headshot photographers. And I coach my photographers there. So it's now been a biannual thing where we do something with the group. So the first thing we ever did is that we took a cruise from here in New York City to Bermuda, and it was a blast. We had such a great time. But we get to Bermuda, and my friend Andrew Campbell is on the Oracle team, and they're training for the America's Cup. And I said to him, I just sent him an email or something. I said, hey, I'm in Bermuda. Can I come check out what you guys are doing? He said, yeah, come on over. So I go over there, and I meet like the head of their media, and he's like, hey, we need some pictures. I said, well, I got a camera. And he goes, well, bring it over. So I go back. They give me a tour. I go back. I get the camera, and we figure out this. I do headshots of the whole team, and then I take Jimmy Spithill, and we take him to this abandoned like building, and we shoot this really good. We throw water on him, shoot a really cool picture. It became the cover of some magazines and stuff. And Jimmy's like, that's my favorite picture ever taken of me. So my worlds collided like that. And since then, I got to do some really cool stuff because of that experience and that relationship with Oracle. So that was just amazing.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. And it's wonderful when these things do come together. I mean, especially when you can look back at it over the years and see the paths that you took, even if you didn't realize you were taking a path, What about Bruce Weber? You want to talk about that a little bit? I mean, it sounded like, from what I understand, you were sailing, and again, maybe dumb luck, maybe just right place, right time, but someone asked you to be a model for a major campaign and a great photographer, right?
Crazy. Yeah. Another one. You know what? I look at that time in my life when I look at it back on it so fondly when I was doing the Olympic thing. And even when I was running around the streets in New York trying to get some modeling work here, it was like those short snippets in life where like so much happens. I was like, what's going on now? I'm like, why was it so crazy then? What's happening? But yeah, so the story goes, and it's truly amazing. My neighbor and I had ended up my neighbor in Maniloking. We sailed against each other all the time, and there was an Atlantic Coast Championship in Maniloking that summer, and I sailed up to like his dock, and he had his sister-in-law there, and he's like, you got to come over and meet her. And I was like, okay. So I sail in, And I go over to the house and she's like, hey, how are you? And you're training for the Olympics? That's amazing. And she's like, have you ever been photographed? And I was like, no. She goes, I got a friend who's a photographer and she worked for Donna Karan. So she's like, you should get some sponsorship. Why don't we put a sponsorship package together and I'll get it to the people at DKNY? I was like, okay. So she took some pictures.
And that is to get you sponsorship to continue the sailing. Is that the idea?
To just help me fund the campaign. I got a bunch of clothes. They gave me some equipment. I mean, it was just, I was sailing with DKNY on my sail, which was really cool. But what happened out of that was that she knew a friend who was a model who overheard that Polo was looking for real sailors for their ad campaign for the summer of '96. And I had to have a meeting. So she's like, look, you've got to come to New York and you got to go over to Ralph Lauren and meet this designer. So I went over there and I met him. And he's like, okay, cool. Let me send you over to the ad agency. So then I go over to the ad agency, I meet them, and I'm thinking that's it. So I go on my merry way. And I'm driving with my boat on top of my van, like I'm going back to the U.S. Sailing Center. I think our trials were in Savannah. So I was driving to Savannah. And I get a call and they're like, okay, we want you to be in Miami this day, blah, 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 blah. And I remember, and I'm like kicking myself to this day. I was like, how much are you paying me? And I think they said like $500 or something like 250, but I don't know. It was very cheap. And I was like, look, I'm training for the Olympics. I can't do it. And I hung up and I went, I didn't know the severity of that decision, but anyway, like a couple days later, an assistant calls me and says, okay, we've got your plane ticket and everything. And I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, you're going to Miami for this photo shoot. And I was like, I said I wouldn't do it. And she said, oh no. And I think they said, well, we're going to pay you $3,000. I was like, okay, I'll do it for that. Something like that. And I get on the plane and then they say, Bruce Weber was shooting it, which, me being a kid from Jersey who was a sailor, like I didn't know anything about the fashion industry. I didn't know anything about photography. So I end up doing the campaign. The pictures go all over the world. And then the New York Times does a story on us for the style section about me, the Olympics, DKNY, Ralph Lauren, Bruce, everything. And it was unbelievable. And the experience was unbelievable. But more importantly, this modeling thing's tough. I ended up, my picture for Polo was all over the place. And I walk into agents that Bruce had made some appointments for me to help me get in agencies. And I walk in the door and they're like, no, you're not good looking enough. It's not going to work out. This isn't for you. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I called Bruce. I was like, they don't want me to do it. And he's like, all right, I'll send you somewhere else. So this is after the first failure of the Olympic trials. So he sends me to this other guy at Next Models. And he's like, oh, okay, we'll give you a shot. Go over to Barcelona and model for a little bit and come back. So I go over to Barcelona, do some modeling, do some in Madrid, come back to New York. And they're like, nah, it's not going to work out. And I was like, oh my gosh. So then it started this whole, let me get settled in New York, run around agency after agency after agency. And it just was an uphill climb. And I put the sailing behind me for that till the story resumes in 1999.
A lot of people don't appreciate the amount of discouragement a lot of creatives get. And again, you're talking about as a model going out there trying to get modeling work. People going out there as photographers trying to get assignments hit the same thing. And I think it's become increasingly more so over the years because more and more people are getting into a lot more of the creative endeavors. And if you cannot handle that element of rejection and disappointment, you can't survive in any of these fields. You have to be able to suck it up and go, okay, let's try this again repeatedly and over and over and over. And I'm willing to guess that if you were to speak to most people who have succeeded in whatever creative endeavor they've been trying to get to, they'll tell you that they got beaten over their head severely starting out, and a lot of disappointment, and probably wanted to quit many times. I would say very, very, very few people walk in the door and get the gold ring on the first shot. That does not happen very often.
Agreed.
But you need that drive, and you've got it. I mean, and you have it. You had it in the Olympics, and now you have it. With your new photographic career, not new anymore, ongoing. That's why it's successful.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta. It's just about what fires you up. I mean, if you've got the desire for something, people just have to figure out what they love. I mean, I just love photography. I didn't know. I really honestly picked up a camera to make a buck so I could get out of a bar. I didn't know I was going to fall in love with it. So it was helpful that just absolutely love this job. I don't work. I just don't. This is not work for me.
What's a bigger escape for you? A nice day out on the bay, or a nice day behind the camera? And I don't mean professionally or just going out for yourself. Just going out, taking pictures, or just catching that right sail. What? Or is there a difference between the two?
I think the sailing's my release. Like I get out of the studio, get out on the water, and I recharge. That's like, especially when I'm sailing a boat that I'm good at. Like I have two boats. One is the Laser, the other one is called an E-Scow, and it's more challenging. And I sail it with other crew members. So I have two crew members, and I've had ups and downs in it. So right now, when I go out in that boat, I just get throttled. I'm just not that good. But in 2010, I was the national champion, which was a huge accolade on my resume. I mean, it was amazing how I won that regatta. And it means it's one of my big ones for me in my sailing career. But if I go in that boat now, I enjoy it because I'm with my friends, but I'm not performing well. So I had my worst day of sailing 3 weeks ago. About 3 weeks ago, I went out on a Saturday in the E-Scow, and I just there were only like 10 boats maybe. And I think I got like sixth, seventh, eighth. I got a 10th. I think I would have finished like seventh or eighth overall for the day, which is not my thing. And it was probably one of my worst days of sailing. And every move was completely wrong. So this is the 180-degree loser effect that I keep going. If I look back at my life, it just looks like, these failures created the drive to be successful. So the next day I get in the other boat, and I was just like, I'm just going to take it out on these people. And I won. I almost won every race. I flipped over in one, and I submerged the boat in another. But I won the regatta, and then it carried on to the next week. There was another regatta in that boat, and I won 7 races in a row. And it's just like, yes, it's like it really depends on where you put yourself. This confidence thing, like I don't have the confidence that I have in the Laser that I have in the E-Scow. So, and it shows on the race course. So it's the same in life. Like I always tell photographers, like if you want to be a portrait photographer, you have to photograph as many people as you can, and you should have people in front of your camera. You should be failing with people in front of your camera every day. Cause I don't remember the good ones. I only remember the ones that were tough, and that made me better. So it's never all roses. And if it is, then you're not learning, you're not growing. And I think the reason for attaining any goal or anything you set out to do is really supposed to be for growth.
How much time are you shooting though? I mean, it sounds like you're on the boat a lot. Or you just
he has his priorities straight, John. That's what's going on.
What's funny? I made a goal for myself. I was like, a couple years ago, I was like, okay, I want to be a world champion. I'm going to have to sail a lot. I'm going to create different sources of income so that I can do that. So I have a lot of teaching products. I make lights with Westcott, which have been amazing because I needed them because I can now travel with them. So now I go all over the world. Wherever I have a regatta, I set up workshops, and I'm able to go. So I forget what year it was. I think it was like a couple years ago. And then I realized I sailed too much, but I was 80 days on the water one year. And I was like, okay, this was a little bit much. I think I got to go pay attention to my business a little bit. But now with this hitting, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't sail. All the regattas got canceled. I can't photograph people because it's just not really that safe yet. And I've been doing a little bit, but not much. And now I'm just trying to find our way. And I think we've got this little hiatus in all our lives that it's really opening up people's eyes to what you really want to do and what really matters most. And I decided that I want to be a world champion. So I'm like, I'm actually, since I can't be on the water sailing against people, I'm in the gym. So I've been working out a lot, and I'm still going to take that seriously. But I wanted to compose my life in a way where I didn't have to be in the studio. And I only had one source of income for a really long time, and that was somebody being in front of my camera. And that obviously it was a good thing that I diversified when I did, because now I'm I love the headshot career. I'm teaching every day. I'm doing stuff every day, and yesterday we were shooting videos. Today I got more videos to do. Tomorrow I'm doing my first workshop since this whole thing started. I've got 6 students coming in. I'm keeping it small, but I'm excited to do it.
Let me just ask one little quick question, and I think it maybe sums up some of the stuff we're talking about. And I've heard you speak about this idea, but you're self-taught. I mean, you've had some people obviously push you and guide you, but what are the advantages looking back, and even some of the disadvantages of being self-taught?
I think you don't know what the rules are, so I didn't know any rules. Like I just was like doing stuff. Like I was like just taking pictures. And now I tell everybody when I learn a rule, it's just meant to be broken. So I did this tutorial with the f-stoppers called Illuminating the Face, and they come into the studio and they say, okay, the first thing we're going to teach is the inverse square law. And I was like, what's that? And they're like, what? And I was like, I don't know any of this stuff. I never look at anything. I had like blinders on. I was just in my studio shooting, and it was all trial and error. Like that's the way I learned. And, being around, like being on sets with Bruce Weber helps. Like you're looking at like what's going on at the top of the industry and then seeing the work that comes out of it. And I just kind of was like, okay, I know where the bar is, and I'm trying to get up there. It's still always trying to get up there. But they came in and they said that, and I was like, I really don't know what it is. They were like, you use it all the time for your work. I was like, I do. And they're like, yeah. I was like, okay. They're like, okay, well, we have to teach it. I was like, well, you're going to have to teach me. And they go, okay, we'll teach you. So they taught me, and then we filmed me teaching it, and then they put it on YouTube. And I can't tell you how many people tell me how wonderful my how it is, and how my explanation of the inverse square law is phenomenal. It's the best thing out there. And I was like, little do they know, I just learned it right before I filmed it.
Right. All right, well, we won't tell anybody. We'll cut this part out.
It's our secret. It's just between the 4 of us. Don't worry about anything. You can say anything you want here. It's just the 4 of us. Don't worry about it. Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we come back. We're going to be talking more with Peter Hurley about 10,000 headshots for free in one day. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app, or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website, and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back. Peter, Headshot Crew, tell us about it.
I guess, years ago I was shooting, like I said, I had blinders on. I was in my studio, I was doing my own thing, and people would call up and be like, I need a headshot. And I've always been kind of expensive. It's like $1,000. I'd be like, it's $1,000. I hear click. And I was like, oh my gosh, that person needs a headshot, but they can't afford me, obviously, because they just hung up on me. I need to do something. And I was like, well, this was my foray into trying to have other sources of income. And I was like, what if I train somebody to do what I do and we charge a lesser price point? And I ended up doing that and opening up a studio in LA and having a photographer out there and photographers in New York. And then I was starting to do that. And then I was like, wait a minute, hold on. I just did it in New York and LA. Why don't I do it all over the world? And my web designer, who had been working with me since we became really good friends, and he had just designed my original website. He was like, well, we can make a website that's like a place for photographers to talk and stuff. And I was like, that's great. And then I was like, this was in 2007 or 2008. We started talking about, we didn't design it until we launched it in 2011. It's got over 17,000 photographers on the site. There's over 1,200 in my coaching program right now. And I have associate photographers all over the world, and we feed them jobs. There's a referral engine built into the site. So they not only get jobs, they get taught how to do the recipe that has made me all the income that I've made with headshot photography, which is really works. So I take photographers in who are either already somewhat successful or are just starting headshot photography, and we turn their studio into something that's rocking, hopefully, for them. And a lot of my photographers are making a really, really good living just photographing headshots, which is phenomenal to me. It's very rewarding. And not only that, the camaraderie and the crew, like my best friends are in there. So I have mentors that help coach with the site. I'm on live on Zoom, 4 days a week, basically. I'm on 2 days a week, but I have other mentors that are doing it the other days. And it's become a phenomenal program. We did Headshot Mania, was the first conference I did, in 2018. And then we just, luckily, by the skin of our teeth, got Headshot Mania 2 done in Vegas right before this all hit. So it was amazing. So I'm doing conferences. I do my workshops. The online coaching is continuous, and it's just a lot of fun, and it's very rewarding for me. So it's really cool. And it's only $25 a month. So it's pretty easy for photographers to jump on it and try it.
This is, I think, a good time for people to reconsider their headshots, because we're no longer meeting in person. And I think it's important right now to make sure that when you're putting yourself out there, and now all you've got is your face, it has to look good, it has to look right, and it has to present a personality. And I was looking at one of your YouTube videos. Actually, it was the one on this 10,000 headshot project, and somebody summed it up. They go, "Your headshot is your digital handshake," and that just nailed it. It really nailed it.
Yeah, that was one of the co-founders of Headshot Booker, Lauren Lieberman, said that, and I thought I couldn't have said it better. That was perfect.
Yeah, it was dead on.
Yeah. Well, what you just said too, I was thinking that while you were saying it. I try and convey this to people all day long, but it's coming from me, the headshot photographer, that's looking for the business and trying to get the awareness of a good headshot out there on a daily basis. So for what you just said, I'm like, the camera's up his nose, he's going nostrilitis on his shot. It's not good, It's like not good. So I'm coaching photographers how to create these better shots for individuals, and it spiraled into this thing of how can we give back? It was actually one of my most successful headshot photographers is Tony Tafin. He's in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he came to me with the idea of starting this headshot booking agency called Headshot Booker, and we use I already have the photographers in place. I've already coached them. Companies are looking for one-stop shops where they have offices all over the country or world, and we can create a consistent product across the board for them. So Tony was like, let's do that. And I was like, because I wasn't going to do it without some help. And I was like, okay, all right, let's do it. So we started up, and then COVID hits, and he goes, I just want to help. I think I'm going to go shoot some people who lost their job for free. And I was like, that's great, Tony, really good idea. And he goes, wait a minute. Well, if I'm going to do it, why don't we just do it with all our photographers, like across the country? And I was like, that's pretty aggressive. I was like, what are you thinking? And he goes, why don't we take 10,000 headshots in one day? And I was like, okay. Oh my gosh. I was like, you sure? Like during COVID? He's like, yeah, let's do it. So Lauren Lieberman is another co-founder of ours. She hooked us up with Brookfield Properties, and they opened up their retail properties to us. So we had
these are shopping malls you're referring to, right?
Yeah. And I went down and did reach out to my headshot crew, and I said, hey, who wants to help? Let's give away some free headshots. No strings attached, totally free. It just felt good to do that. It was amazing. And how appreciative everybody was. It was really an eye opener, because usually everybody's, paying me a pretty penny coming here and they're thankful and stuff. But the ones, it was some people it was interesting to see the people who were really thankful and appreciative of it. And some people were like, that doesn't, you could get a better shot of me like that. I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, and they didn't know who they were coming to. Like we set it up so, they didn't want everybody in. I was down at Brookfield Place here in Manhattan, and nobody wanted to, we had another setup with a bunch of photographers out at Uptown. And we just didn't say what photographers were where, and we just had people sign up. So whatever photographer they got, they ended up getting. We tried to do it in every major city across the country. It was challenging. We had some help. Canon sponsored, which was phenomenal. We had an awesome delivery service called Spot My Photos that you would shoot the person and then they would instantly get text in their phone with the pictures, which made it so much easier for delivery to get the pictures of these people because of the amount of numbers we were doing.
Straight photos, no retouch, no editing, just
yeah, we did
camera to their phone.
Yeah. So what I did was I coached them on the lighting. My shots are really clean. Like the setups that I do, I coach in the headshot crew 3 setups basically. It's a parallel lighting setup, a triangle setup, or a square. And I coached them. We did Zoom calls and coached the photographers on what they were supposed to do prior to the event. So the shots looked pretty clean. We did offer retouching if they wanted it, and most of that was free. Sometimes people, like if they really wanted it to look good, and we would hire out retouchers, but we didn't want them to feel like they had to spend. We wanted to give them the picture, so if they had a friend that would retouch or whatever, just we obviously. I don't like to over retouch my photos, so I don't like people, taking them and going crazy with them. But in this case, we just wanted to get them the shots, and we created a Facebook group for the attendees, and we started to get all these messages about them getting jobs and the shots actually helping. So it was a huge undertaking. And
how long did it take to set it up? I mean, even to get Canon involved, was it a week or two, a couple of weeks? It sounds like it must have been.
No, it was like it took months. You guys helped. We had support from B&H. You guys helped immensely with getting gear to the photographers. And Gabe's always got my back, and he's like, it didn't work out with the COVID thing. We were going to have your live team come down and be with me for the day, but it unfortunately didn't work out. But the support that we got from B&H was phenomenal, because the photographers were able to get gear that they otherwise couldn't have gotten through, just reaching out and talking to the marketing team, which was huge. I mean, it was just a huge thing, especially during this time, for you guys to make the stuff that they needed accessible for them was awesome.
I'm curious about one thing. Now, these are all photographers that are already working with you. These are your head shooters, right? Now, don't they have equipment that they're using? Obviously, you must have a standardized lighting system. If these are essentially franchise operations, there has to be uniformity, which means that whatever lighting you're using, they should be using. So did they not have lighting, or did you just want to have additional lighting there? Why did you need Canon or anybody else involved for this? Because it seems to me everyone's got cameras, lenses, and lights.
We didn't. I mean, Canon was there just to support with funding to help us. What we did was we got all this signage and stuff. Flash Drive was on board, and they helped us. We had the little circles on the floor 6 feet apart, and we had all this signage and all this stuff, and we were FedExing stuff all over the country for every photographer got a package. And it was because Canon liked the idea so much that they were the only ones to buck up and give us the funding that we needed, and we went over budget, but hey, we couldn't have done it without Canon. So no, not every photographer has my same setup, but I coach them in a way that it's a very simple, like whatever gear photographers have, I can teach them how to take a good headshot with it. It's not like rocket science, but they have to work at it. And if they work at it, if they get 15 shots that are consistent in a portfolio by me, they become an associate on the headshot crew. And that's where they really begin to fly. I think we've got 140 some odd associates across the world. And if they're an associate photographer, it's a major vetting process. Like to get by me, I don't make it easy. It's very difficult. And
hey, your name is on it. It shouldn't be easy.
Yeah. And then once they're there, then I feel very secure giving them whatever jobs are coming down the pike. So those are the ones that go into the headshot booker system. And those are the ones we're getting referrals every single day through the headshot crew and through headshot booker now. And they go out to the associates first and foremost, unless another headshot crew photographer is in the area. So if you go to headshotcrew.com and go into the find a photographer, you'll see, you can type any town and it'll show the closest photographer that is in my program. We have 17,000 on the site. There are photographers that don't show up in the search. So if somebody's not close, there's chances are somebody is close. So for 10,000 headshots, I went into the back end and went, okay, who's not part of the coaching, like essentially, there's a $12 fee if you want to get into the photographer search a month, or $25 gets you the coaching with me. And there's a slew of stuff in there, hundreds of videos, and you get a newsletter with a new video from me every week, and all this other stuff that we do. But if they're not in there, they're still in my system. So I'll go in and search for them, check out their work. And a lot of the times for the 10,000 Headshots Initiative, I reached out personally and said, hey, we need somebody in your area. We've got a Brookfield property. We can set you up. You just have to show up that day. I want to see what kind of kit you have. We did questionnaires with the gear and what they were using. And it was really interesting what the photographers had. And we did recommended setups and everything like that. So we also did testing. So I said, look, go test your setup. Take a picture, take a BTS picture, send it to me. We'll do during our Zoom calls, which we did weekly. We coached on the shooting, so that photographers, even if they were a little bit, weren't as seasoned as others, we wanted to make sure everybody had a good experience at 10,000 Headshots.
Quality control. Yeah. Okay. I'm impressed with what you did up front to get all this to happen. Any follow-up stories or anything like that afterwards? Feedback from people who went through it? Any interesting stories as a result of what you did and your crew?
The notes that I got, and this is the thing, I decided a long time ago what my purpose needed to be for this photography thing, and it was basically having people more confident in their appearance and a better relationship with their appearance than they had previously from being in front of my camera. And that's what it was. And my way of spreading that is through the headshot crew. If I can coach a photographer how to take a good picture of a person so that person is more confident because they were in front of that photographer's camera, we really did something, and we can spread that around the globe. I think people are too harsh on themselves with their appearance and the way they look and the way they present themselves to society. And now with this everything so digital and everything so visual, it becomes even more important. So we had people writing in that, they changed the way they felt about themselves. The feedback that they got from friends and family and anybody who saw the shots was phenomenal. And it turned into jobs. It actually turned into them getting jobs, because I think an employer, even though it's not required on a resume to have a picture of somebody, I think before you hire somebody, you're probably going to Google them, hit images, maybe look through their social, just try and get a sense of the person. And if you just offer that picture up ahead of time and just say, hey, this is me, this is what you're getting, here's what you're going to see, because they're probably doing meetings over something like Zoom or Skype or whatever. It's just nice to have a really nice picture to follow it up with. And I think that it helped, and it did help open up doors for people. And like you said, your buddy is like, who's going to give him money if he looks like a slob on a couch rather than, spruced up a bit?
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing. And also I think anybody would understand that, we all have a certain self-impression of what we are, our strong points and shortcomings. And I think we're all probably a little bit cruel on ourselves. But you definitely have a different feel about you when you put on a new set of clothing or a suit and you step out. You have a different attitude. I dress pretty casually as much as I can, but I know that when I put on a suit, there's a different, or even just dress up a little bit more polished, there's a different attitude that goes on with that. And these days, you don't have an opportunity to walk in the door and say hi and make an impression. It's that photograph. That's who you are. And then you have your voice and your personality, which comes after that. So it's all part of the package. And I think a lot of people have to realize that a headshot isn't just a pretty picture of you. It's really represents who you are and can make or break whether you're going to be getting something or not, be it a job or whatever the case may be.
How important is it, and do you consider yourself kind of skilled at finding that characteristic of a person that kind of stands out? They may consider it an ugly characteristic, or who knows? Everyone looks at themselves differently, but is that a skill that you kind of have or work on to kind of say, all right, let's focus on bringing out this aspect of their personality or their hair, their eyes, something that maybe another person wouldn't notice, but you think is worth it?
Well, what I have found is that the beauty's always there. Like, we're human beings. We're gorgeous individuals. Like, it's just unbelievable that we exist at all, and let alone worry about the way we look. So there's always ways, and it comes through energy. Like, it's like if somebody feels good about themselves, they're going to photograph better. Like, our subconscious is just going to kick in. Like, nobody even thinks about their expressions all day long. You don't walk down the street and go, I'm walking by somebody, I got to pull the corners of my mouth toward my earlobes now so they get a little smile out of me. No, your brain does that automatically. With the mask on, it's a little different. But the point is that we don't take conscious control over our expression until we're in front of a camera. Sometimes you do in front of a mirror, but in front of a camera, it just becomes weird. And the number one thing that I've learned since I've been photographing is that our brain will try to tell us what our face looks like, but it doesn't know. So now you've got your brain telling you your face looks strange right now, or this is a cool face or whatever. And the photographer's looking at you and you're blank and doing nothing and not giving any energy to the camera. So the photographer has to understand that and stop and create an atmosphere for the person to flourish. And people who don't like the way that they look in general, or just don't know what to do, usually look fearful. And fear in a headshot doesn't pan out. It just makes the onlooker want to look away. And that's not what we want. We want to draw people towards us rather than away with that. And if I was, I'm charging them to do this, so I have to convey. In my work, it's all based on confidence coupled with approachability. And then what happens is, if people are having, enjoying themselves in front of the camera, or creating that or getting more confidence. Confidence is contagious. So I'm very confident behind the camera. So when I start directing people, they know exactly what they need to do. Like, they don't have to do anything. And I think that I do things with them that make them go, whoa, what is it? And my method, the number one question I get from my students usually is, how do you get somebody to relax in front of the camera? And there's a very simple answer. You make them forget about the camera. And the only way to forget about the camera is through the relationship that you've developed with them it doesn't matter how much time you've been with them. It can happen in a split second. Like, I don't meet people before I shoot them. They come in the door, and that's where it all starts. It goes right from there. And I read their energy, and I'm like, okay, this person's got a lot they're really stressed out about this. And I have to go into this mode of getting them to chill. And sometimes people walk in, and if people want to watch the TEDx talk, that's what this is about. It's called Bridging the Self-Acceptance Gap. It's like, it's just the way that it is. This is the way we are in society. I never had anybody walk in my door and say, Peter, this is your lucky day. My hair is incredible. My skin is flawless. I slept like a baby. It's gonna be easy on you. It's always like, oh my gosh, I'm late. I'm sweaty. My hair's a mess. It's like we lived in this fault-based society. So photographers hear that all the time. And I'm always like, okay, let me get rid of that. I have to get rid of that energy and turn it around. And the only way to flip it on its head is to have a product that you're confident in, and that is going to be something special for the person, and confident in yourself. So when you start to, work with somebody, they feel it and they know they're in good hands, and that does it. And then once you do that, if you can do that on a daily basis, you really got a business for yourself, and people will talk about it. And then it just, that's the way you get your best referrals from your work,
Peter, absolutely a pleasure talking to you. If people want to catch up with more of your work and what you've been up to, websites, Instagram, where can they go?
Website's peterhurley.com. Instagram is Peter_Hurley, and headshotcrew.com is the photographer site.
That's great. And again, all of this will be on our show notes if people want to follow up. And I suggest you do. There's some great stuff here. Again, it's more than just a headshot. And Peter, again, thank you so much for being on our show. And I know that you've had a lot of interaction with B&H in the past and all kinds of endeavors. And hopefully we'll continue this way. And thank you again for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I didn't even get to my story. If people watch was a Headshot Redefined, and I go into tears telling my B&H story, because you guys started my speaking. My speaking all started in the event space at B&H, and that was where I started this whole thing. So I really have to be, I'm so appreciative of B&H and what you guys have done for me, and it really strikes a chord with me, and I love you guys. So thanks for having me on.
That's great. And by the way, if it wasn't for B&H, I wouldn't be a podcast host, so I know what you're talking about. They just took a chance on me one day, so there you go. Peter, thanks again. If you'd like to get a heads up the moment a new B&H Photography podcast goes live, it's easy. Simply head on over to wherever you get your podcast fix, type B&H Photography Podcast into the search field, and boom, you are part of the family. You can also find us on the B&H Explorer website and on the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. All that said, my name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you so much for tuning in today.